Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. And welcome to another Bookmas video. Today we are going to be talking about my best books of 2023, but we're doing it a little bit differently. Think Goodreads Choice Awards categories, think G from Book Roast end of year book awards. Basically what has happened is that I had a very just average reading year, and honestly I couldn't think of 10 books that I really would want to put in my top 10 best of the year. So this list is comprised of 10 categories. We have best fantasy, best sci-fi, best horror, best mystery. You see what I'm saying about the Goodreads Choice Awards categories. And I thought this would be a fun way to narrow down what I loved in each genre. While some of these are not even like high 4 stars, they were the best of that category for me this year and therefore are on my top 10. So we're going to start out with the best romance of 2023. 2023 was the year that I explored romance heavily. So I was like, you know what? I'm gonna start exploring romances that I like to see on television. And that is like small town rom-com, a woman in her 30s or late 20s or whatever. I would like an older protagonist, I'm not gonna lie. But so far it's been like women in their 30s exploring their life again in a different way. Like something has come up in their life that they need to work through. They move to this small town, they're learning about themselves, they're finding themselves again, and along the way, they fall in love. Typically, I have found that I also love when the town kind of has a personality. Not only the characters, but the town itself is sort of a backdrop that is its own character, as well as the supporting characters in the town having big personalities and getting into mischief. So the book that really ticked those boxes for me, it's a book and a feeling when I read this book that I'm constantly looking for, and it was my first 5-star of 2023, and that is Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez. This was my favorite romance of this year. I think about these two all the time. This one is fun because it doesn't necessarily follow the conventions that I was talking about fully, because Alexis, our main love interest, she is a doctor in a big city and she ends up getting flat tire in this small town and ends up getting help from Daniel. He gets her out of the stitch, but they go their separate ways. Alexis is a little too shaken up, so she ends up going to a bar in this small town and runs into Daniel and his friends, and they have amazing chemistry, so they kind of just start sleeping together. But Alexis is not ready to have a relationship with Daniel because she finds out that he is 10 years younger than her, and she kind of wants to call it quits, but Daniel's like, why should we care about this age difference? We're just having fun. And Alexis is like, you're right, but the problem is she's sort of falling for him, and she just got out of a really toxic relationship, and as a matter of fact, she still lives with the man that she was in this toxic relationship with because they're trying to sell the house. So you get to see some intense moments between her and the ex and like her healing from this really abusive relationship, and Daniel really helps her with that, and this relationship ends up blossoming into something really beautiful, really cute, and really healing for Alexis. But also Alexis has this really great healing journey on her own that isn't a part of this relationship. It's just that this relationship with Daniel started to open her eyes to what she might want in her life, and I loved it so much. I love these two main characters. They had great banter, they had great chemistry. Because Alexis lives in a big town, she drives into the small town all the time, and they go and do things out in the small town, and you get to see a lot of the side characters. That was probably my only critique of this book, was that I wish we saw more of the side characters, but I felt like we met some people who are gonna be in future books, so I think we'll get to see more of this town. But either way, this was my favorite romance. It was actually one of the only romances I gave a full 5 stars. It had to be my best romance of the year. Category number 2 is the best fantasy of the year. So I think this one is going to come as a surprise because this year I did read the first 2 books in the realm of the Elderling, but for the sake of not making my whole list about Robin Hobb, I did choose a different fantasy because this is a fantasy book that I think about a lot, and it was the most surprising fantasy book that I read in terms of how much I enjoyed it, and that's Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. I was not expecting to like this, and honestly, it is a fantasy, but it is like a fantasy sci-fi, which is something I've been seeing cropping up a lot more recently, and I've been more and more interested in it because pure sci-fi sometimes works for me and sometimes doesn't, but fantasy always does something for me. I love fantasy. I love fantastical worlds. I love magic systems. I love world building, and I especially love character dynamics in fantasy worlds. So fantasy sci-fi has been something that seems to work well for me. This is the second one I've read this year, and this is obviously the top fantasy that I've read. It was the most memorable for me. I did end up giving this a 4.5, but it is a very interesting premise because we're following 3 characters characters, one of which is an Aboran person, and Aboran people are almost alien-like species, but they've recently gone through a blood plague and lost the majority of their population, and they have been struggling to repopulate. So we're following Tormolin because his perspective of this world is that his people are dying, he doesn't have a long time to live, so he wants to have adventure. He ends up partnering up with our secondary main character named Vintage. Vintage is a human, but she is also an explorer and a scientist, and she's trying to figure out what happened in the 8th reign. So while she's trying to do her studies, she has Tormolin basically being her bodyguard. So anytime they run into trouble, he's the one to help. And the third character is a witch who is broken out of this prison where all of these witches are being held, and she ends up meeting up with Tormolin and Vintage just by chance, and they end up coming together and making this weird trio who is now exploring the end of the 8th reign. So while we're on this adventure with them, we are learning about the different reigns, and we are learning about the Juralia people. These are the people that actually disappeared at the end of the 8th reign, and this is sort of what Vintage is trying to figure out, because in their wake of disappearance, they left these weird ghost monsters and other types of monsters within the world. Plus, the disappearance of these people could also mean the collapse of the empire. I loved this. There is a lot of sci-fi elements, there's a lot of fantastical elements. The characters were some of my favorites. I think Vintage is the star of the show. She is so funny, she is so sarcastic. But Tormolin and Noon are also very interesting characters because we are learning their backstories. They come from different worlds. The Abora people have been struggling with the death of their god and a blood plague, and then the witches, we know that they've been locked up and they're held in this prison, but we don't really know why, and we don't really know what Noon is running from or what she has done. So all of the elements of this book just really worked well for me. For whatever reason, this was giving me 5th season vibes. Definitely not the same, but I think if you like the vibes of 5th season, you might enjoy this. Personally, I think the 5th season is better. That's one of my favorite series, but this definitely gives those same vibes. And I think if you especially love the science fiction / fantasy elements of it, you will really enjoy this. The only reason this wasn't like a glowing 5 stars, there's like a forced romance in here that was very bothersome for me, and it really took away from some of the plot. Otherwise, I could just ignore it, but it really took away from some of this plot and some of the character development, in my opinion. Moving into our third category, we have the best sci-fi that I read this year. And this has to go to Fina. I randomly listened to this novella one day when I was cleaning the house, and I was so enthralled. We have 2 main characters named Ava and Jules who work in this big box store similar to IKEA, but it's not quite IKEA. And Ava and Jules work together here. They were also dating at a point in time, but they've recently broken up. So when you start the story, Ava is on her shift, and Jules had like traded their shift to not be there because it would have been awkward. But the person calls and is like, "I'm sick, you're gonna have to take your shift back," and they end up seeing each other, and it's super awkward, and they're like kind of bickering, and then suddenly there's like an urgent message for all employees that one of the customers has just disappeared. And so they realize that there are portals within this big box store and customers are getting lost in them, so it's up to Ava and Jules to find this customer. And through this adventure, they end up forming a friendship. And this book was just so fun. It was so queer, it was so funny, and I really liked the sci-fi elements of it. I think this is some of my favorite type of sci-fi, is just the fun, like low stakes, cozy almost sci-fi, because this was more focused on the characters and their relationship and like finding peace within that relationship and friendship as well, and realizing that maybe they didn't need to be romantically involved and that they can have a beautiful friendship together. And I really, really loved this. It was such a fun surprise. The next category is the best horror that I read this year. I will say that I didn't have the best horror reading year, but the ones that really stuck with me, and I think they'll be favorites of all time. And so for this category, I had to pick Monstrilio. The fun thing about this was that it was on my radar, but it wasn't an immediate, I'm gonna read it. And then Kayla from Books and Lala invited me to be on her Literally Dead book club, and this was the selection. And honestly, I think all of us really, really enjoyed this one. I, at first, was going to settle on a 4.5, and the more time I've spent away from it, it's totally a 5-star. This is hands down the best horror that I've read this year, and in some ways, it's more of a literary horror rather than a you're gonna get scared shitless horror. This is mainly pitched as as a mother losing her son and going through this grieving process and trying to regrow her son by using a piece of his lung. But it's really a family saga. And I think the ultimate question of this book is, what would your grief drive you to do? And you get to see that through these characters. So this is told in 4 parts, and you get to follow Monstrilio's mom, Monstrilio's father, Monstrilio's, she's like an aunt, but she's also a best friend, also a lover of the mom in the story, and you get to follow Monstrilio. And I think this was so beautifully told. I am so glad that we did get all of these different perspectives. Not each perspective was as strong for me as some others, but I'm so glad that we got these different perspectives, and it made the story so much more well-rounded because we were seeing grief from all sides. We were not only getting to see the internal grief of these characters, but we were also seeing their grief from other characters' perspectives. And it really is just so beautifully written and beautifully told, and it's such an interesting exploration of grief that I never even thought that I needed. I really like grief horror, and it works so well for me. I've been finding that grief in literary horror just does something different for me than just the horror that has you on the edge of your seat. That is also a horror that works for me really well, but these ones have just been hitting me in a different way. And so I'm so glad that I read this. I'm definitely gonna read everything by this author. The only thing I will say about this is don't go into this expecting that it's just a mother grieving type story. There is so much more to it. It's so queer, it's so sex positive, it's exploring sex and queerness in a very interesting way. And I think that's also something that I've been really enjoying about some of this grief horror, is that there is a lot of queerness and exploration of queerness and grief that has really been speaking to me as well. So 5 stars, absolutely loved this. And I'm so glad that Kayla ended up pushing it higher on my TBR because I don't know if I would have gotten to it this year. The next category is the best contemporary that I've read this year. I dabble in contemporary and literary fiction, and honestly, I think this is going to be contentious for me to put this here because I think some people would say that this is actually in the horror section, and I think that it's more literary fiction, and it's Our Wives Under the Sea. So I know that this is considered for some people horror. I didn't feel like it was horror, and I know I was just talking about grief horror, and this could be considered grief horror, but this to me just read so much more literary than some of the grief horror that I have been reading, because at least with Monstrilio, there is a lot of horrific moments in it. But in here, it almost is like a metaphor for a breakup. So we have a couple, Leah and Miri, and Leah is a marine biologist, and she ends up going on this exploration in a submarine, and the submarine gets lost. It goes black, and Miri hasn't heard from her in weeks. And when she comes back, weeks later, she is changed. So Miri is going through all of these emotions where we're seeing her emotions and her thought process pre-Leah going on this exploration, during Leah in this exploration, and when the ship goes black, and then post when Leah is back. And it reads like grieving a relationship, whether that's a breakup or the death of a partner. It just very much reads like somebody mourning this relationship, mourning this loss, and trying to move on the best that they can. And I really, really loved it. It was so beautifully written. And there are some uncomfortable moments, but it just read like this really beautiful literary fiction with some weirdness in it. And that's my type of literary fiction. I really like almost a surrealist type of literary fiction where we don't know what's real, where it's a little bit weird, where we're questioning the sanity of some of these characters, or we're questioning if what the characters are telling us is true. And this just really gave me that. It was so beautiful. And by the end, I was just mourning with Miri. Like, I felt the emotions that she was feeling, and I think that's why this had to be one of my favorites. I didn't really rate this at first, but I definitely think this is a solid 4.5 stars for me. But the writing is beautiful, and the metaphor that I got from it was really stunning. The next category is the best mystery or thriller that I've read this year. And I actually I cannot believe that I'm putting this on this list, because usually I have not liked this author's work. But The Only One Left had me in a chokehold. It had me on the edge of my seat. Typically, I don't like Riley Sager, but this was more mystery than thriller, and I have come to learn that I'm more of a mystery than a thriller type of girl. And so this one just really worked for me. So essentially this follows 2 characters. We have Lenora and we have Kit. So basically Kit is a home care provider, and she used to provide home care for her own mother, and then her mother passed away. And we find out in the beginning of the story that there was something weird surrounding her mother passing away. And so Kit was put on probation. She wasn't exactly fired because they couldn't prove if Kit was involved involved in the death of her mother, but they know that something weird is surrounding her death. So they put her on a year probation, and we are seeing her come back after this year probation. And they decide to put her on a home care rotation for a patient named Lenora. And Lenora is infamous in this town as killing her whole family. To this day, they haven't been able to prove if Lenora actually killed her entire family, but the rumors remain and people are very scared of Lenora. So Kit is no different. She grew up in this town. She grew up hearing the horror stories about Lenora. So she's terrified, but she's gonna do it because what other choice does she have? So Lenora was in an accident that rendered her mute and disabled. And so Kit is there to just take care of her basic needs. And in this relationship that they kind of form, it is seen that Lenora can use just her left hand. And she wants to tell Kit her story. And so we get to learn about both of their stories actually. And it was so twisty and turny. And I think that the characters were extremely interesting because we as readers don't actually know if either one of them are innocent or not. We are also seeing flashbacks to the past, Lenora's past and Kit's past, and like the way that it twisted and turned and weaved together, I was just along for the ride. I remember I read it in the summer and I was setting up one of my Girls Who Code programs, and I was like going as slow as possible setting it up so that I could finish this book. I was so engrossed in it. No one could talk to me. I was like, I'm sorry, I've got to know what's happening. I loved this. It was the best mystery / thriller that I've read this entire year. I haven't read that many this year, but this one was by far the best one. I had so much fun and I was very shocked. I was very shocked because I have not enjoyed Riley Sager in the past. The next category is the best nonfiction that I read in 2023. And this hands down has to go to the 100 Years War on Palestine. And while this year I have read quite a few different books on Palestine, either fiction or nonfiction, this hands down was the best introduction for me. This one really lays a great foundation. And while it's a slower book to get through, I think it took me about a month to actually like get through it and really absorb everything that it lays out in the last 100 years. I think that it was one of the best introductions that I have ever read because it really breaks things down historically. And I think that foundation is very important to understand what is happening current day. So I really appreciated the way that this book was broken down, but also the way that it was written, because I feel like sometimes when you are trying to read about a new subject, you take to these books and they can be maybe a little too hard to understand, not because of what the context is, but because of the language that they use. And I was very appreciative that the language was very accessible and this entire book felt very accessible. So I highly recommend. There are audiobooks, ebooks, and physical copies of this book. I listened to it on Hoopla if you have Hoopla. It's also on Libby. I've seen it all over Libby. And so it's very accessible. It's easy to get. I don't rate nonfiction, so I didn't rate this, but it was hands down the best nonfiction that I've read this year. So now we are moving into categories that are less about a genre and more about an experience that I had. So this next category is the best audiobook experience that I had. If you've been around here for a little while, you will know that I love listening to audiobooks. Audiobooks make my days go by. They are how I get through so many chores. They just make my life better. I also love tandem reading things. It's especially helpful when you're getting into a brand new world. I just love audiobooks, okay? And so to narrow down my best audiobook experience was really hard, but the first book that came to mind was the book that I had to choose, and that was The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi. Are we surprised? Probably not. This book is so conducive for an audiobook experience because this is a book that is basically being told to you. Like the adventure, the way that it's written, it is being told to you. It is kind of meant to be told to you. So we are following our main character, Amina Al-Sarafi, and she is now in her mid-40s, and she is retired from piracy because she had a child and she doesn't want to expose her child to that lifestyle. In the beginning of a book, a mysterious figure comes around and sort of has something that she could blackmail Amina with. But on top of that, she's offering Amina a lot of money to go on this adventure to find this person. And at first, Amina is very reluctant because she doesn't want to expose her child to this. She said she was never going to get back into piracy. She has retired. She has sworn this off. Her crew has, for the most part, all retired. She doesn't really know where all of them are. But on the other hand, the amount of money that's being offered to her would actually put her and her daughter in a really great position for the rest of her life and her daughter's life. As you would, she ends up taking the deal because because she really needs to secure a better future for her and her daughter. So she gets the whole crew back together and they go on this really wild adventure, and it was very fun. And it's almost Pirates of the Caribbean like. I've kind of talked about this in the Goodreads video if you watched it. This was very much what I've always been looking for in a piratey book, because I love Pirates of the Caribbean and I've always wanted a book that kind of gives me that same feeling. Pirates and Amina are very different, but they still give you that same vibe. Like, Amina is not Jack Sparrow, but she's sarcastic and it's silly and it's seafaring, and they're on these like wild adventures, and there's lots of different creatures and there's lots of different lore in here that was very interesting and just worked super well for me. But the reason that this was such a good audiobook experience was because the entirety of this book is basically being told to you from Amina. There's a scribe who is present on this ship and is getting Amina's story about these adventures that she took. So it's literally being told to you, and the way that they've done the audiobook, there's moments where Amina is telling the story and then somebody in the background says something and she addresses the person in the background. You can tell she like turned to say that thing because the voice gets muffled. So I really enjoyed my experience reading this book. It was very fun, and the audiobook experience just made it that much more fun. So I ended up giving this a 4.5 stars, and I would give the audiobook experience a 5 out of 5 stars. So our second to last category is the most impactful / the book that left the longest lasting impression. This one was hard for me because I was going back and forth with the idea of what was impactful and what left a lasting impression, and was there a book that did both? And I would say that yes, this book did do both. I don't know if it was like the most impactful book that I've read this year, because I think that I read a lot of nonfiction that would be considered more impactful. But this book, the characters, the way that this was told just left a really lasting impression for me, and that is The Goblin Emperor. I don't know if you would consider this to be more cozy fantasy than anything else, because this is very focused on our main character, Maya, and it is all about his growth and his journey and his life. So it's very focused on character, and there's not much in the way of like a magic system or like a looming war. You know what you think of when you think of fantasy books. This is more lower stakes, but it's also high stakes because he becomes an emperor without ever having training. So I'm not sure if this would be considered a cozy fantasy, but it's definitely not a fantasy where the world building and the magic system is going to bog you down. It's all about characters. I will say, this is one of those books that I definitely tandem read because the language that's used is very specific. There's lots of titles, there's lots of phrases that we're not like super privy to. So there's like a listing of persons, places, things, and gods, and this is very helpful to understanding the way that they address each other and the things that they're talking about. So this glossary is very helpful, but that should be telling for you that you will have to reference the glossary to kind of understand sometimes what they're talking about. That being said, I tandem read this. I listened to it and read it physically, and I loved it. I loved it so much. It was definitely a 5 out of 5 star fantasy for me. It was the most impactful because I grew to love our main character Maya so much, and everything that he was going through. He was just a sweet little baby angel. And I think about this book all of the time. So it definitely left a lasting impression for me. But basically, you're following our main character Maya, and he is half goblin. So he was born of a marriage, of an alliance, of a treaty, and his father really didn't want anything to do with him, and he didn't want to raise him in the court because his mother was a goblin. And so Maya has spent his whole life with his uncle because his mother did pass away, and his uncle and him have a very contentious relationship, but his uncle is kind of under this obligation to take care of him and raise him. And one day the uncle gets word that Maya's father and Maya's brothers, who are direct descendants of the throne, have all died in this tragic accident. So therefore Maya is now the Goblin Emperor. He has to take the throne. He is technically the next in line to take the throne. The problem is that Maya has never been raised in the court, doesn't understand court politics or dealings, and so he's taking this throne completely ignorant to what he needs to do and what his role actually looks like. So this whole book is surrounding him like learning about his role and learning to navigate people trying to manipulate him and take advantage of him, but also realizing that his freedoms, his privacy, the life that he has been so accustomed to has been stripped stripped away from him, and he doesn't really know how to reconcile his feelings with that. He wants friendships, but he's so scared to make those friendships because he doesn't know, is this all politics? Are they only around me because of political gain? And he tries to make friendships with like the people who are his security and people who are supposed to be in like his coat of arms, and he's not really supposed to have relationships with them. And the way that they're trained, they're like, we can't be friends with you. Like, we love you and we respect you, but we can't be friends with you. And this just really hurts Maya. So he continuously has these situations where he really desperately wants certain types of friendships and he can't have them because of who the people are, but he's also very scared of making friendships because of the possibility of them being fake or only for political gain. On top of that, he's trying to reconcile his freedom and privacy. So he has this moment that, like, I think about it all the time, where he just wanted to change and take a bath, and how his attendants weren't leaving the room and the security guards were like right outside his bathtub. And he's like, I will never be able to just take a bath alone. I will never be able to just change alone. And he has this really devastating moment where he's realizing that his whole life will never ever be what it was before, and that maybe he really enjoyed that simple life of his. So this book really is about Maya navigating this newfound responsibility in his life, a whole kingdom. But also there are friendships and there are romance, and there is some mystery about whether or not the accident with his father and brothers was actually an accident. And we do get to see really interesting and cool parts of this world that really build up the world building a little more than we normally have been getting throughout the book. I think Maya will be a character that continuously sticks with me, and the sweet little moments that he has with different people and him just being such a sweet little baby angel cinnamon roll. So I think this definitely had to fit in the book that had the most lasting impression. And the last category is simply my best book of 2023. You might be able to guess because I haven't talked about it yet. I feel like I read this pretty early on in the year, and this was absolutely a 5-star. I cried a lot. And I'm so thankful that I read this because I ended up reading it for Patreon. I've had this book for a while. It came out a while ago. I've always intended to read it, but then I got a little bit nervous because I did try to read it at a different point in time and I just wasn't ready for it. It's The Vanished Birds. Are we surprised? I don't think we are. If this weren't my favorite book of the year, it definitely would have been the book that had the most lasting impression for me because I think about this every day probably. The characters in here were chef's kiss. I felt so attached to them, and everything is just tragic and sad, to be honest. The thing about this book is I feel like it's a book that I wouldn't want to give too much away. I would rather you just go in not knowing that much about it, but for the sake of giving you some interest in the book, I will say that this is a sci-fi. It's definitely one of those sci-fis that's more character driven. And I think the best way to pitch this is that there is a woman named Naya, and she travels through space. Her job leads her to many different colonies and many different planets where she is interacting with many different people. And on one of her journeys, she ends up taking in this little boy. Something has happened to him that is very traumatic that he just refuses to talk about, and he is shut down. And so he spends time on the ship with Naya and her crew, and he ends up forming such beautiful bonds with all of these people, but all of these people also have their own like really unique friendships and bonds and relationships, whether that be romantically or just sexually. And it is stunning. It's stunning. I know this book's not going to be for everybody, and that's fine. But something about these characters and the way that I grew so attached to them so immediately. But on top of that, like the way that they grew attached to each other so immediately was amazing. So the characters and this little boy and Naya are really the focus of the story. Like they are the core of the story. But there's also some political things happening as well, because this book is told in a very interesting way. It has different parts, and in part one, it's told in almost vignette-like style. So we are following different characters and different timelines, and these characters are important to the plot, but they're not the ones that you're gonna end up following in the end. This is probably like 50 pages of the book where we get these small vignettes, and then we go into part two, and part two is where the story really picks up with the characters that we're gonna be with for the rest of this journey. But the vignettes really set up the world, the politics, they set up Naya, and they set up this journey that she's about to take with this little boy, because this journey really changes her life, and it obviously changes the little boy's life as well. And this journey lasts years. It lasts years and years and years, and there are some really beautiful moments moments and really impactful moments, but there are also some really, really devastating moments. And I will say that I was just sobbing at the end of this book. It was uncontrollable. And if I think too long and hard about the ending, I will cry again, so I'm not going to. But I gave this a 5 out of 5 stars. It's the best book I have read this year, and the reason that I was hesitant to read it, this was pitched to me as, if you like A Long Way to a Small Grey Planet, then you will love this. If you know me, you know that I love The Long Way to a Small Grey Planet. The first book in that series is just like a cozy, good time, and I absolutely loved it. And so I was going into this with that expectation, and that comparison is not necessarily wrong. But when you hear The Long Way, you just think cozy, found family. There are some hard moments, but for the most part, everyone's kind of happy-go-lucky and they're teaching each other lessons and they love each other. And like, yes, that could be said for this book, but this is more tragic. This is not the same. This is definitely a little more intense in the politics, in the world building. But again, like I said, those things, you will understand them once you get through the story. Like any confusion that you have at the beginning of this book, which will happen, by part 2, you will definitely understand things, and things really come together so beautifully by the end that I wouldn't worry if you have any confusion in this book. It will come together. Also, the last thing that I want to talk about is the writing in this book is absolutely some of the most beautiful writing that I've read this year. I think up there with Monstrilio and Our Wives Under the Sea. Like, this is so beautifully written. I can't tell you the amount of passages that I was highlighting, that I was like losing it over because they were so beautiful. I would reread lines, highlight them, annotate. Like, I definitely think this is a book that's worth rereading just for the prose alone, because I couldn't get enough of it. It was so beautifully written. And again, I don't think this is going to be a book for everybody, but it was the perfect book for me at the perfect time. So it's hands down my favorite book of the year. So yeah, those are my top books of the year in each different category. And honestly, I really like the style of doing my best books, only because it makes me really think outside of just one genre. As you know, I read a lot of fantasy and I read a lot of horror. And so it's nice to like have to think outside of that box to find my best books of the year. And it was really easy for me to be like, okay, my favorite sci-fi, yes, absolutely this one. So I really like this way of doing it. I hope that you enjoyed it as well. Let me know your best book of the year, or let me know the best books that fit into these categories. Also, I will link down below videos that are similar to this, where somebody is doing a book awards rather than just their top 10, so that you can check those out as well. If you've made it this far and you want to leave emoji, feel free to leave a trophy emoji or like one of those blue ribbons, the #1 in show, you know what I'm talking about? Also, this is the end of Bookmas, so thank you so much if you've been watching my Bookmas videos. I've had a lot of fun doing this, and I hope to do it next year. But again, thank you so much for watching any and all of the Bookmas videos that you did, and I hope that you have a great holiday and a great new year, and I will see you all in 2024. Bye, friends!